Whenever anyone asks me what my favorite fantasy story is, it's not a book that comes to mind. 99% of my favorite fantasy stories are books, but the one that sits above all of them was actually a video game. What's shaking? My name's Cam, welcome back to another video. If you read a lot of fantasy books, then I would love it if you stuck around, even if today's video technically isn't about a book. Hopefully you'll like it anyway. It's something a bit different. This is completely unscripted. I'm just kind of talking off the cuff about my favorite fantasy story. And like I said, it's a video game. I'll cut straight to the chase. It is a Final Fantasy game. I think Square Enix and their catalog of games, especially Final Fantasy, are probably the best games that have been made. That's my personal subjective and completely correct opinion. And I want to talk a bit about Final Fantasy today, especially considering that in just a couple of months' time, I think we'll have Final Fantasy 16, which I have been very, very eagerly awaiting for. If you're not familiar with Final Fantasy, they are RPG fantasy games, and although there are going to be 16 of them as of a few months, they're each unconnected from each other unless it's, like there's Final Fantasy X and then Final Fantasy X-2. Obviously those are connected, but Final Fantasy IX and Final Fantasy X are different stories. So I'm going to tell you which of them is my favorite, and I'm going to talk about the story of it and why I like it so much. I have been playing the hell out of Final Fantasy XIV, which is the online MMO Final Fantasy. The story for that game is phenomenal, like literally one of the best stories I've ever experienced. It's absolutely just, it's crazy. I don't know how Square Enix keeps doing it. The people that they bring onto their writing teams are just exceptional. If you play Final Fantasy XIV, you should let me know. Before we get into it, I'll just say straight up, it's not Final Fantasy VII. I know that is the one that everyone kind of worships. In fact, I think I might have one of the most unpopular opinions ever when it comes to the Final Fantasy series, and that is that I actually liked Final Fantasy VIII more than 7. I know the gameplay mechanics were wildly different and took a lot of getting used to, but in regards to the actual story, I think Final Fantasy VIII is one of the most underrated, not just video games, but like stories ever told. Final Fantasy VIII isn't my favorite either, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about it just very quickly. So Final Fantasy VIII basically follows a bunch of young students at this what is essentially a military academy called Garden. They're raised and trained there to be mercenaries, sellswords, who will carry out contracts for, the headmaster of the Garden. That's the catalyst for the story kicking off, where you go out into the world to start doing your very first jobs. And one of the very first big conflicts that you have is against this enormous, tyrannical military force. And it's just so cool, like the cinematics and the battles, and towards the end when you're running away from a giant robot spider and there's a timer counting down until it's too late. I think Final Fantasy VIII was one of those games where it just managed to keep you thrilled almost the entire way through. That was my experience. And then just when you think you might be getting a bit bored with the non-stop action, it starts pulling at your heartstrings with these huge emotional moments where your character, which is, Squall, he's like this extremely closed off, introverted character. He's quite selfish and he doesn't think a lot about the feelings of others. When he finally starts opening up emotionally to the other characters that you've been playing with, and then they grow to become this family, it's just really sweet. There's a love storyline that is just beautiful, and probably one of the best and most unique things about Final Fantasy VIII is that there are these flashback time travel kind of sequences. That's not really a spoiler, but Squall's romantic journey parallels with those flashbacks, and it's just so sweet, and also births one of the best Final Fantasy soundtrack songs, Eyes on Me. Just fantastic. Anyway, that's Final Fantasy VIII. Depending on how this video goes, I would love to do a full video on that game, because I have a ton of feelings about it, and there's so much about the story that I haven't even told you. But getting into my favorite of the entire series, Final Fantasy X. So a bit of a funny story on how I actually ended up getting this game. I was I was a kid. I was young. Yeah, I know it was like 50 years ago. I'm old. Yeah. I was a kid and Simpsons Hit and Run had just come out and I wanted it. I wanted it bad, I'm not gonna lie. So I nagged at my mum for, days and days. I nagged and nagged and nagged and finally she gave in and she took, I was a brat. I was a bit of a brat. She took me down the Big W. We walked into the video games section. I frantically started searching the shelves for Simpsons Hit and Run, and yet I couldn't find it. Where was it? Where was Simpsons Hit and Run? After speaking to the, store attendant there, I was devastated to find out that it had sold out. It was a very popular game. Why don't they remake that game? Like, remaster it? That's kind of crazy, right? Because literally everyone wants that. You think that would be like an easy bag. So they didn't have Simpsons Hit and Run, so my mum was like, you can either grab another game or it's going to be no game. And I looked around and I couldn't really find anything I liked. At the time I'd played Final Fantasy VIII and loved it. So I saw the cover for Final Fantasy X and I was like, maybe it'll be good. I was still really bummed out about the Simpsons Hit and Run thing. So anyway, I begrudgingly grabbed it and went home, and I honestly didn't even really want to play it. I just didn't want to pass up the opportunity for a new video game because it was very hard to convince my mum to buy me things, which I understand completely now as an adult. Now I understand how money works. But we got it, I went home and I popped it in, and then I experienced the first cutscene where it introduces you as Titus. I understand a lot of people say it's pronounced Titus. I'm not saying that, I've always pronounced it Titus. A superstar athlete in a game called Blitzball, which we'll get back to, in this kind of futuristic city, right? And right off the bat, one of the things I loved was that it shows you very clearly that your character is a celebrity. People love you, they want to be around you. There's a little bit right at the very start of the game where you're literally having to push through a crowd to get to your Blitzball game. And then it cuts to the cutscene, and I'm not even kidding. A song by Ramenstein starts playing. If you don't know who Ramenstein is, just have a look on YouTube and try to associate that with a Japanese-made RPG game. It's kind of funny, but it was epic. It's, the cinematic starts with your character. He's leaning back, he's chilling out before the game. Eyes pop open. Guitars come in, crowd's gone crazy, everyone's losing it, they're roaring. The Blitzball stadium explodes open, this big bowl of water. So Blitzball is basically like a football game, except it takes place inside of a big bowl of water. I can't even describe how cool it is, and I obviously can't play the song here, but I highly recommend going and checking out that opening cinematic on YouTube, even if you aren't interested in playing the game. And try to imagine what it was like as a child, just seeing that come up at the very start of the game and being like, what am I about to experience? Anyway, moving forward from here, and there will be minor spoilers from this point on. I'm not going to give away anything big, but during the course of the game, you see this enormous, whale-like creature come out of nowhere and start shooting, laser missile things, and the city starts getting destroyed and blown up, and your character comes to after he's, been knocked to the ground and passed out, whatever, and that's where the game really begins. That's where the combat starts. You're fighting your way through this demolished futuristic city, trying to get to safety with the help of an old friend. And then just when you think you've made it to safety, the big whale thing, it's named Sin, pops up and your old friend yeets you into it. Pretty weird. Just yeets you right in there. Anyway, fast forwarding just a bit, you meet some interesting new characters. They save you, from basically just dying in this desolate, miserable, ruined city. You find out that it's 1,000 years after the attack. Somehow you've been taken 1,000 years into the future. And then eventually you will find yourself at this just remarkably beautiful location within this fantasy world. It's like a super tropical, Lilo and Stitch style Hawaii island, and the people on there are obviously based off of islanders, super friendly and welcoming, which is where you meet one of my favorite characters in the whole game, Waka. Waka has what I would like to refer to as Big Brother syndrome. His role in the game is to be kind of like a surrogate Big Brother, but even as the player, you can just feel Big Brother vibes from this guy. He's friendly, he'll take the mickey out of you at every turn, but he will like die protecting you, that kind of thing. Waka is great. And it's on this island that you'll also meet a few more characters, most importantly Lulu and Yuna. Minor spoiler alert, Yuna becomes the love interest, and I think I fell in love with her as a child. There's also Kamari, who is a big cat boy, sexy cat boy. And it's at this point where you really start getting a lot of world building for this fantasy setting that you've been thrust into. What you'll find out is that the big creature Sin, who took you here, is basically just like this giant, almost cosmic monster who is essentially immortal and just likes going around and just destroying things, like just killing people. Like, why not? It just likes going around causing a bit of chaos. And the only way to get any kind of reprieve from this creature is for these certain people within this world called summoners to harness this ancient magic that calls down these creatures that will help them fight. In the story known as Aeons, in past Final Fantasy games they've been called other things. For example, in Final Fantasy VIII they were called GFs. Not like girlfriends. So the summoners call down the Aeons, and at a certain point at the end of their journey or their pilgrimage, because they have to travel across the world acquiring these different Aeons, at the very end they will get the final Aeon, which is the one that will actually kill Sin and give the people of this world, Spira, 10 years of calm, or in the story it's called the calm, before unfortunately Sin is reborn again and the cycle continues. And it's just circular, and the story deals a lot with the themes of the circular nature of life and death and grief, and basically just when you think you're just ready to be okay again, it comes back and it just keeps circling. That's a general idea for the story, and your character joins along on this adventure because he is determined to find a way to go back in time, back to his home, back to Zanarkand, and he keeps telling the love interest Yuna that he will show her Zanarkand one day. You really get a feel for just how much these characters are bonding throughout this journey. For example, Titus and Kamari don't start on the best of terms because Kamari is very protective of Yuna, basically like an older brother, and he sees Titus as an outside threat. And towards the end of the journey, they're as thick as thieves, and it's just that found family trope is probably my favorite trope within fantasy. I adore it. It's one of the best ways to get me invested in a story. And a lot of people have pointed this out, but I'm going to point it out as well, that the advantage that a video game has over a book or, anything like that is that it really puts you in the seat, and as soon as you feel like you're the one making these decisions leading to the next story point, even if technically it's not, even if the game is actually guiding you there, you feel like it's your decisions bringing you here, and so you get more invested. And without getting into major spoilers, there are a few twists along the way that are absolutely heartbreaking, and it calls for some of the most tear-jerk moments I've probably ever experienced in a story. One of the best things about Final Fantasy X is that it's not just like a surface level fantasy RPG. It really gives you a lot of complex and interesting world building in regards to Spira and how Sin has affected the people of this world, because like I said, it's a constant cycle of grief, and the amount of trauma and impact that's had on a lot of these characters it's heartbreaking. Like, for example, Waka, who is a character that we end up really, really liking. He's a likable character. We find out that his little brother was a soldier who fought against Sin using, in the story it's called Machina, but it's basically just forbidden machinery, because they believed that would beat Sin, and unfortunately it didn't. And Waka had to deal with the betrayal of his younger brother using what is essentially religiously outlawed devices, because Waka is quite spiritual in this story for the most part, and his brother did something that severely betrayed his trust, but then he's also dealing with the grief and the guilt of not being there to support his brother before it was too late. And now Waka has this other guy, Titus, come in, who ends up being kind of like, again, a surrogate, kind of like a younger brother who he has an opportunity to get that second chance with. He doesn't want to squander the second chance of actually being there to have their back and support them. That's a level of depth you get with pretty much every character in this story. That old friend I mentioned at the start, Oren, who is actually another one of my favorite characters, he actually ends up tying in a lot with a lot of the backstory, because Yuna's father was the last summoner to kill Sin, and Auron was one of 2 people who helped him along the way. I won't say who the other one was because that does feel like a spoiler. Anyway, it's very tricky to talk anymore about this story without getting into major spoilers, but if you haven't played it, I would highly recommend it if you're into RPGs, especially if you're into Final Fantasy. What I will leave on is that the last cutscene for this game, only thing in a video game ever that has made me cry. And I don't mean just tear up, I mean cry. Like, I won't tell you why, but it after the first time I finished it as a kid, I don't think I left my room for a week. You know, everyone in my family would have thought I just lost a pet. Anyway, I know this was a super weird random video. Hopefully you enjoyed it anyway. I'm not becoming like a video game review channel or anything like that. I've just been thinking a lot recently about like my favorite fantasy stories, and I just really felt like I wanted to talk about this. So I will be back to talking about books in the next video, but if you did enjoy this and maybe you want to see me do a full video on Final Fantasy VIII or maybe Final Fantasy XIV, let me know. What's your favorite fantasy story? Does it happen to be a video game? Thank you for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. You are my favorite. I make lots of videos about fantasy books, and I've made a lot of videos about fantasy books, so if that's your kind of thing, I would love it if you stuck around. Otherwise, maybe I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.